Hey, friends, Kenny Ortiz here. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to properly craft and write a thesis paper. Now, if you are one of my students at Bethany Global University, you should follow these instructions to a T. However, if you are a student at another school, you just want to make sure you check with your professor, make sure that you have read the syllabus for your class. That's generally one of the best pieces of advice I typically try to give my students is be an expert of your syllabus. Thoroughly understand what your syllabus says and doesn't say, and ask questions for clarity. It's really important. It's amazing to me how often students get something wrong or miss something just because they didn't carefully read the syllabus. So if you're not one of my students, make sure you've done that with your particular class when it comes to how to write your thesis paper, or maybe some of the details of the assignment related to your particular thesis paper or research project. Before I get started, one quick book I would recommend. This is required reading for my students at BGU, but you may be somewhere where this is not required reading. But the book is called From Topic to Thesis. Michael Keeby, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, Keeby. It's super short, as you'll see. It's a super short book. It's kind of small. I mean, it's just like the size of my iPhone, right? It's not even that big. It's a super short, quick, easy read. It's really, really helpful. It's got some big picture kind of thought process that you ought to have. So some ideology that you ought to have as you start approaching a research paper, specifically a theological research, right? So it's written from a faith-based perspective, but by a scholar, giving us some thoughts on how to approach theological research, and then how to then utilize the research we've acquired, or the information we've acquired through our research, and how to craft it into a quality thesis paper. So make sure you check that out. Michael Keeby's From Topic to Thesis. Highly, highly recommend and commend that to you. Okay, so let's talk about thesis paper, the thesis and the formation of your paper. This is really, really important. I'm just moving my notes around here. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. So it's really important. Number one, you want to pick a topic. Now, I know this sounds pretty simple, but I think sometimes people get caught up on a thesis. They get caught up on an angle before they just pick a topic. Just pick a broad topic. All right. Don't feel like you have to have a specific clarity on what precisely you're going to read or write about. Just pick a general genre. I tell this to my students all the time. When it comes to particular topics or subtopics within our class, just pick one and go with it. Don't feel like you have to understand it thoroughly before you pick it. And sometimes students allow their lack of knowledge of a particular topic to kind of paralyze them from diving into a topic. It's like a lot of students demand of themselves that they understand a topic before they've studied the topic, and that's counterintuitive, isn't it? Like, you're holding yourself to an unfair expectation. So don't do that. Secondly, start reading and researching, right? I think sometimes so many students, they feel the need to have a clear thesis already in mind, or they feel like they have to have a really, really strong understanding before they dive in. No, just dive in, start reading and research. And frequently, you are better off selecting a clear thesis or a particular angle for your paper after you've done some reading and research. It's perfectly okay to dive into the topic and be new to it. What you want to do is, and you'll see on the screen there in my notes, you want to enter the conversation. So what I'm teaching my students, what I'm trying to teach them is how do doctoral students kind of think about this? So you want to think about research as stepping into a conversation, right? So let's say I was going to do research on, I'll pick a theological topic, the atonement. Right. The topic of atonement is, what did Jesus accomplish at the cross for his believers? You know, what precisely happened at the cross, and how does that impact individual peoples? How does that influence and impact my relationship with God? How does what Jesus did at the cross impact his relationship with the Father? How does it impact his relationship with humanity? How does it impact Jesus' relationship with Satan, right? There's all these questions that are within the genre as called the atonement, right? That's the broad terminology we would use. Atonement. What did Jesus actually accomplish at the cross, and what are the implications of that? So if I were going to do a thesis paper on atonement, I just pick a topic, atonement, and then I would start reading and researching. Okay. And what I'm doing is I'm effectively entering into a conversation, because theologians and scholars and pastors have been discussing the atonement for centuries, for the better part of 2,000 years. There's been a conversation going on, and I don't mean a literal conversation, right? There's just been writings. But here's how this is how I tell my students to visualize it. Imagine if you could get every major theologian and major Bible scholar and every prominent pastor for the last 2,000 years. If you could bring them all back from the dead, and throw them all in one room. Like, you get some gymnasium somewhere in the world that's large enough to get every major theologian and scholar and pastor, and they're all in one room, and they start having a conversation about the atonement. What would that conversation look like? When you are writing a thesis paper, your goal is to enter into that conversation. You want to walk into that gymnasium, and the first thing you want to do is just shut your mouth and just listen. I think that's the first. It'd be quite arrogant for just about any student to assume they had enough information and knowledge to jump right into that conversation, right? If you're talking about if that room, if guys like Clement and Origen and Augustine and Athanasius, right? If John Chrysostom and Anselm, if those guys were, and Martin Luther and John Calvin and right Jacob Arminius and Charles Spurgeon, right? Whatever, you can go down the list of all the prominent names. If they were all in that room, and you walk into that room, you assume you immediately have the goods to speak up. I think that's probably a little bit arrogant. The same idea should be rattling around your head as you approach a particular thesis paper. When you start reading and researching, don't assume that you've got enough knowledge to be able to speak into this conversation. Don't walk into this genre. Don't walk into this conversation with pre-existing opinions. Don't walk in assuming you know everything already. No, you should walk into the conversation simply assuming, listen, I probably don't know much about this. Let me just listen first. This is a really, really important thing. Now, of course, this make-believe gymnasium, the scenario that I've made up, doesn't actually exist. So how do you enter the conversation? Well, you do this through reading. You do this through reading with objectivity, with prayer, with humility, and with a caution to avoid forming an opinion too quickly on certain things, right? So you want to enter the conversation cautiously, as objectively as possible. No, we're all subjective. We all struggle with prejudices. We all struggle with biases. We all struggle with being kind of creatures of our culture. We all struggle from groupthink. All of us are far more subjective than we realize. However, to the best of your ability, you want to fight to be objective and be willing to consider every conversation. In that conversation, when information is coming at you, you want to objectively consider it and critically evaluate it. Now, if it's wrong, then you want to discard it, right? But you want to be careful that you don't discard things too quickly when you're listening to the conversation. The entire point of a thesis paper, the first phase of it, is you're simply entering into a conversation. And the way we do that in the 21st century, particularly when it comes to theological research, is simply by listening to the voices that have gone before us. And you want to go find who are the most prominent writers, the most prominent preachers, the most prominent scholars throughout the histories that have written about that topic. So going back to my example on atonement, if I was trying to find all the experts on atonement, I'd be pulling some great names from church history, and from recent history as well. And so I'd be reading all these things to try to get a feel for what's the conversation been, who has said what, who responded to that person, what are all the major views. And I want to kind of just get a lay of the land before I really dive into forming my own opinions. Now, once you've entered the conversation, you understand what's going on, then what you want to do is you want to then develop a thesis. And a thesis is in essence an opinion. It's an opinion statement. That's what a thesis actually is. It's an opinion. And the way you do this is once you've entered into the conversation, once you've listened enough to all the voices, there's a couple different ways to to develop a thesis statement. You can either find a pre-existing opinion that already exists in that room and go, okay, that's an opinion that so-and-so holds that I think is a good opinion to defend. And you want to take their opinion and you want to then adopt it as your own. And that's the opinion that's going to basically form your thesis statement. Your thesis statement is the statement that you are going to defend in your thesis paper. Remember, a thesis paper is not just a report. You're not just reporting information, right? In elementary school or middle school, maybe even in high school, book reports or historical reports were quite normal, right? Research projects are really just finding information and then kind of regurgitating it in some, quality fashion for your teacher as the evidence that you've researched the information and now you have an understanding of what has happened or what types of things are out there. But that's not what a thesis paper ought to be. A thesis paper is not simply reporting information. A thesis paper is entering the conversation, understanding the information, forming an opinion of one particular component, right? You're not reporting everything in the conversation. You're taking one component of the conversation, one component of the subtopic, and you're forming an opinion, and then you are defending that opinion. So if I entered into the conversation, let's say talking about the atonement, one person in the conversation would be Anselm, right, from the Middle Ages, who wrote extensively, wrote lots of things about the atonement. And Anselm has some great writings about some great writings that lead us to this idea of atonement called penal substitution, right? That's what Anselm. That's one of the doctrines that Anselm discussed and kind of championed. And so I might come to the conclusion that this opinion held by so-and-so is the right opinion, and therefore I want to take this opinion that Anselm held and I want to defend that, right? I want to say this is the right view. So that's my thesis. So I want to develop a thesis. So once you've developed a thesis, again, a thesis is an opinion or a position that you are going to embrace and defend in your paper. The next thing you're going to do when you're forming your paper is you're going to outline all the evidences for your thesis, right? So if I am going to argue for penal substitutionary atonement, that's a type of atonement. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal for the purposes of this video. If I'm going to argue for a paper, though, for a particular view of the atonement, specifically penal substitutionary atonement, well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline what are all the evidences for this thesis. And in a paper like this, in most cases, it's going to be scripture, right? I'm going to outline what are all the pieces of scripture that point to what I believe is the view of the atonement. And then I'm going to have sub pieces of evidence. So let's say I'm going to argue that Romans chapter 4. Again, I don't actually think Romans chapter 4 is a chapter I would actually use if I was writing a paper on the atonement. Maybe I would, I don't know. But let's just pretend that's a chapter I would use. Then my evidence would be Romans 4. And then my sub-evidences would be, okay, what's some commentaries or views on Romans 4 from people in the conversation, right? So maybe I get a sermon from John Chrysostom, or Chrysostom, as some pronounce it. I get a sermon on Romans chapter 4 from John Chrysostom, that was preached 1,500 years ago or whatever it was, a long time ago. And then I'm going to have some commentary from Augustine on Romans 4. And then I'm going to have some commentary from John Calvin on Romans 4. And then I'm going to have some commentary from John Owen on Romans 4. These are all my sub. And then maybe I want a contemporary one. Maybe I want some commentary from John Piper on Romans 4 and from N.T. Wright on Romans 4. Right. I don't know. I'm just, if you know anything about atonement, that's probably not how it would work out. But the point is, here's my main evidence, and there's some sub evidences, right? Then my next evidence might be for penal substitutionary atonement. Let's say we would do, Hebrews chapter 10. That's my next piece of evidence. And then I'm going to have commentaries. Okay. What did Jerome say about Hebrews? What did Augustine say about Hebrews? What did, Athanasius say about Hebrews? What did Matt Chandler, a recent pastor, What did he say about it? What does GKBO, who's a world-renowned scholar today, what does he say about this in Hebrews chapter 10? Right. So I'm taking my main evidences and then my sub-evidences. There may be some other evidences if I'm writing about the atonement, other than scripture. There may be some things from the world of logic, right? There may be some rhetorical arguments or logical arguments that I could bring to the table as evidences. There may be some understanding from the world of legal cases, right? The world of law and justice. There may be some examples or pieces of evidence from that. There may be some pieces of evidence from natural theology, from the world of nature, that point to my understanding of penal substitutionary atonement, right? Whatever it is, there are these pieces of evidence, and then there's sub pieces of evidence, and I want to outline all of those. That's kind of my next thing I do. So after I've developed the thesis statement, my next thing is to outline evidences for the thesis. That's big. And then I'm going to outline counter evidences. This is really important. This is where a lot of students really struggle. You want to outline if someone disagreed with you, if someone thought your thesis was wrong, if your statement was flawed, or they thought your opinion was flawed, what pieces of evidences would they likely bring to the table? Now, in your paper, you don't have to outline all the evidences they would bring to the table unless you have enough time for that. If it's a really long paper, then you may have that. You may want to do that. Typically, for my students at the undergraduate level, my papers are 1,500 to 2,500 words. So typically, you're not going to have a lot of real estate in your paper to have a lot of counterpoints, but you want to have some. But if you're writing a longer paper, if you're writing a paper for a grad class that's 6,000 words or 8,000 words, then you're going to have much more space to do more. But basically, you want to make sure you have an outline of all the pieces of evidence that basically go against your argument. And this is really, really important. A lot of students just don't get this right. A lot of students miss this. So it's really important that you outline what are the evidences, and you want to make sure you be really good at it. I'm always looking for this as a professor when I'm grading students' papers. I want to know, if I disagreed with you, what pieces of evidence would I bring to the table? What are the best 2 or 3 evidences that I would use that I think are the best? And I'm asking myself, did this student do enough research to figure out what are the best 2 or 3 or 4 evidences against their argument? Did they enter into the conversation thoroughly enough that they could identify, okay, here's the thesis that I agree with, but here's what other people are saying that disagree with this person or disagree with this position or this idea? So it's really important that you outline your counter evidences. And then you want to interact with those, right? So in your paper, it's not just enough to outline where people disagree with you or how they disagree with you. Then you want to clearly explain why you disagree with those. And you want to make sure you do that in a logical and coherent manner. For those of you who are watching this who are my students, you'll be familiar with Mortimer Adler's work. If you're watching this video and you're not one of my students, I would highly, highly encourage you to check out a book called How to Read a Book. That's the title of the book, How to Read a Book, by a world-renowned philosopher and educator in the mid-20th century, or prominent throughout the 20th century, by the name of Mortimer Adler. If you don't want to read the whole book, you can skip to the chapter where he says, what can the reader say, or how can the reader disagree? And there's one particular section where Adler talks about specifically what are the 4 things you must measure or utilize when you are determining whether or not you agree or disagree. So frequently in our society, in contemporary 21st century societies in the West, people really have people think highly of their own opinions, particularly those of us who live in the United States, because we're entitled to certain constitutional rights. People then assume that they're entitled to having an opinion on everything, which is not the case. There are lots of people that are not entitled to an opinion. I'll give you an example. I am not a medical doctor. Therefore, I am not entitled to an opinion on medicine. Like, if you come to me, you have a really gnarly rash on your arm. Okay. I could tell you what I think it is, but my opinion may mean 0. You don't want my opinion. You want the opinion of a doctor or a physician assistant or an RN. You want someone who actually has expertise in that area. The only person who's entitled to an opinion on what that rash on your arm is someone who's been trained properly to identify rashes. Kenny Ortiz has not been identified or has not been trained as someone to identify rashes. I mean, I could take a guess. I've seen some rashes. I've had poison ivy in my life. I've had some rashes in my life. I know what I think they look like, but I'm not entitled to an opinion. My opinion is not an intelligent, informed opinion in that regard. And so many people assume that their opinions are intelligent and informed and are worthy of being listened to. No, the vast majority of opinions that are being propagated on social media and in our pop culture on so many topics, quite frankly, are not opinions you should listen to. Most people don't have the right to have an opinion on a lot of things. And yet a lot of people have opinions. And so Mortimer Adler, I mean, and he's writing this in 1940. It's amazing that this applies so perfectly 80 years later. As I'm recording this video, it's 2020. Mortimer Adler's work is brilliant and so helpful in so many ways. I would so encourage you to go and read that. If you're one of my students, go back and read that chapter. The 4 things, if you're going to say you disagree with someone, you must be able to point out that the person you disagree with is either uninformed, misinformed, illogical, or that their study is inadequate. So often in our society, contemporary society, when people say I disagree with you, what they really mean is I don't like what you're saying. Because in most cases, they actually don't have any information to actually contend against what you're saying. In most cases, people just say, well, I don't like it. So they say, well, I don't think I agree with you. That's a really flawed way of arguing. So I would exhort you, I would implore you to abandon that way of arguing. And if you're going to disagree with someone, you have to be able to say to them, I disagree with you. And the reason I disagree is because I think you've committed a logical fallacy. And then you must explain how they've committed a logical fallacy. Or you must say to them, hey, I disagree with you because your study or your analysis is incomplete. There's a piece of information that you haven't thoroughly studied, or you haven't studied enough yet for you to even have a thorough opinion or an informed opinion on this. So I would challenge, I disagree with you because I have a different perspective because I've studied something either more adequately or I've studied more broadly. Or you need to be able to say to someone, I disagree with you because you're uninformed. There's a piece of information that you're missing. Or you must be able to tell them that they are misinformed. There's a piece of information that you have, but it's actually wrong or flawed. I think that's important, right? So those are the 4. You must be able to tell someone, if you're going to disagree with them, that they are either uninformed, misinformed, illogical, or inadequate. Those are the 4 categories that Mortimer Adler dialogues in his book. In your research paper, you must be able to do this in your paper. You must point out, here are the counter evidences. Here are the pieces of evidence that would go against what I'm defending in this paper. And then you must explain why you think they're wrong. So let's go back to my example on atonement. Let's say I was writing a paper on atonement and someone came to me and says, no, I disagree with penal substitutionary atonement because of XYZ reason, or whatever the reason is. I must be able to come back and say, listen, this particular position that they are coming at me with, this particular evidence is not, doesn't undo my opinion because it is uninformed in some way, or because it's illogical in some way. I must interact with the information that's come at me, and I must thoroughly disarm it by using one of the quality reasons for disagreeing. And I think Adler's rubric is really, I think it's the best. There are other rubrics, other philosophers and educators have asserted throughout the years about how to disagree and how to articulate disagreement. Dale Carnegie has some stuff out there on his books, and there are others. Stephen Covey has some stuff where he alludes to that. John Maxwell. There have been other authors throughout time, but in my opinion, Mortimer Adler's is so good and so far superior. That's the one I typically recommend. And if you're one of my students, you know you're required to have read that and understand Adler's arguments there. So make sure that you do that. So you're gonna pick a topic, do some reading and research. You're entering into the conversation. You're going to eventually develop a thesis statement or an opinion. You're going to outline all the evidences for that, all the sub evidences and sub pieces of evidence for each of those evidences. Then you're going to outline the counter evidences, things that would come against you or things that would prove your opinion wrong. And then you're going to interact with those. You're going to clearly explain why you disagree with those. And you're going to do that in a logical, coherent, and thorough manner in your paper. That's really important. Every section or every subsection is kind of you're countering the counters. That's really important. And again, Mortimer Adler's metrics or rubric for disagreement, in my opinion, is the best out there. Not the only one, but just the best in my opinion. Okay, a couple other things to consider when you are writing a thesis paper. Your paper should start with a brief introduction and then the clear thesis statement. Something that Michael Keeby says in his book is that your thesis statement must be stated early and often in your paper. I should not have to go more than a paragraph through your paper before I figure out clearly what your statement is, what your thesis statement is. This is one of my most common pieces of feedback for some of my students. I'm like, I'm on page 2 or page 3. I still don't even know what you're defending. I'm unsure. It's muddled. Make it very clear for me, right? And I'll give you some examples of thesis statements in a bit, but it's really important. So start with a brief introduction, right? So if I were writing a paper on atonement, my paper may start by something like, throughout the centuries, throughout the generations of church history, there have been various understandings of the atonement. The atonement is the study of what Jesus accomplished at the cross and its implications in various genres of theology. This paper will defend, or this paper will assert, that the penal substitutionary atonement theory is the theory that the Bible defends, right? Something like that, right? That's probably kind of messy, but you get my point. The point is, I'm going to give you a brief introduction, 2 or 3 sentences, and then I'm going to clearly state my thesis. Okay. It's really important. By the way, I'm always going to do it in third person. Now, if you're not one of my students, you may want to check with your professor if they prefer first person. I always tell my students, I never want you writing in first person. We always write in third person. So you never should say I or we ever, or our. No first person pronouns, whether that's singular or plural. You're never using those. You're speaking in third person. So you want to start with a brief introduction and then clearly state your thesis statement. Then you're going to define your key terms and components. I sort of already did that in my introduction when I defined atonement. Some papers are not going to need a lot of this. Some papers are going to need more. So it depends on how confusing the terms are. There are some topics where there's a lot of different terms. You just want to clearly explain what you mean by certain terms. Okay. And so you just want to make sure that you just clearly define, here's a brief introduction. Here's a clear thesis statement. Then you want to say something like, for the purposes of this paper, this terminology or this term blank, whatever it is, XYZ, refers to blank, 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 right? Whatever that may be. I think that's really important. Make sure you just clearly state what it is you are actually arguing for. I wrote a paper not too long ago where I was basically arguing that the ramifications or the results of the first Great Awakening in the 18th century was more beneficial for American society than the ramifications and results of the second Great Awakening of the 19th century. And so I think my thesis statement was something like, this paper will examine the series of revivals known as the First and Second Great Awakenings, with special attention being given to the key personalities involved in those events. Right. That's basically this paper will assert and defend that the results and ramifications of the First Great Awakening were far better for American society than the ramifications and results of the Second Great Awakening. And then I said, for the purposes of this paper, we shall determine the results as, and then I defined what I meant by results. Like, what does that mean? And then I defined, for the purposes of this paper, society will be defined as, and I'm defining what I mean by society, right? I'm defining some of my key terms. Now, for my students, I prefer that this is done toward the beginning of a paper, but you don't have to do that. In fact, for some topics and for some writing styles, it may make sense to actually do this as you go along, right? Maybe you don't do it immediately, but as you are introducing concepts throughout the paper, maybe you introduce a concept and you take one sentence to define that concept, right? Just do this. If there are any key terms or key components in your paper, don't assume that everyone understands what those key terms mean. In fact, in a lot of different areas, we need to assume that we have different definitions. So it's key for you to know that whoever's reading and grading your paper needs to know what you mean by certain things. We want to know, how are you using this term? What do you mean by this? I think that's an important concept to consider. So You're you're going to have a brief introduction, clearly state your thesis. You're going to define your key terms, components. Then you're going to outline and defend your evidences, right? As I talked about. So this is the structure of your paper. Start with a brief introduction, clearly state your thesis, give some definitions if necessary, and then begin to outline and defend each piece of evidence. Here's evidence 1, here's evidence 2, here's evidence 3. And each of these evidences should be a separate section of your paper that you are then outlining. Then you're going to interact with your counterpoints, as I already talked about earlier, right? Then you're going to give a clear conclusion. This is really important. So many students don't do this. A clear conclusion. Basically, your paper is this. At the beginning, you're going to tell me what you're going to tell me. And then in the middle of the paper, you're actually telling me what you're telling me. And then at the end of your paper, in your conclusion, you're going to remind me of what you just told me. Okay, like that's basically it. So your conclusion just needs to be a few sentences, just, a paragraph or less. It's brief, but you want to just clearly kind of drive home your point. As this paper has outlined, the First Great Awakening was far more beneficial than the Second Great Awakening because blank, 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 blank. I just want to restate those 3 evidences. Blank, 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 blank. And then I usually want to end my paper with one clear exhortation statement. For that paper, it was contemporary pastors would be wise to draw more from the writings and preachings, the writings of the preachers of the First Great Awakening than that of the Second Great Awakening, right? Like that's the exhortation I'm giving. What basically, if someone reads this paper, what do they do with this now? What do you want them to do with it, right? If I'm writing a paper on atonement, the end of my paper, my last statement may be something like, contemporary evangelicals ought to embrace and defend penal substitutionary atonement theory, right? Or something like, contemporary pastors ought to defend penal substitutionary atonement theories, because that is the ideal understanding for modern evangelicals. Something like that, right? What do you want me to do with this paper, with this information you just gave me? You just wrote a paper that was, 5 pages, 6 pages, 20 pages, whatever it is. Give me one clear sentence at the very end. What do I do with this? I think that's helpful. Maybe it's more than 1 or 2 sentences, right? If it's a longer paper, it's going to be a few sentences. But give me a clear exhortation. So this is the structure of a good thesis paper. Particularly if you're one of my students, make sure you nail this. All right. Brief introduction. Clearly state your thesis. Define your terms as needed. Outline all your evidences and defend them. Outline all your counterpoints and interact with them. Explain why you think they're wrong. Okay, and then at the very end, give a very clear, strong conclusion. This is, in essence, the structure of a good thesis paper. For my papers, I typically require my students to use at least 8 scholarly sources. If you're not one of my students, of course, you're going to want to make sure you check with your professor or check your syllabus for that. At the school I currently teach at, Bethany Global University, we use MLA formatting. If I'm honest, I'm not even a fan of MLA formatting. It's not my favorite, but that's what we use at the school I'm at. So that's what, make sure you do that. Just make sure that you are using whatever formatting is required for you. So this video obviously is structured more for my students. Everything should directly support the thesis. Everything in your paper should directly point back to your thesis. So either they're pieces of evidences that clearly point to your thesis, or they are evidences that go against your thesis that you are clearly dismantling, or you are showing why those supposed evidences are wrong, right? If anything doesn't clearly defend your thesis, get rid of it. So many papers have extra information that's just unnecessary. Get rid of the fluff. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. Cut, 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 cut. It'd be so helpful. Okay. This PowerPoint that you're looking at, I crafted for an assignment that, for my students on campus. The assignment's 1,500 to 2,000 words. I am very, very strict on the minimum. I am not always strict on people going over. If a student goes over, so if you're one of my students watching this, just know if you go over the word count limit or range, as long as you don't have a lot of fluff, it's fine. Like if the cap is supposed to be 2,000 words, and let's say you go to 2,200 words, but it was a really good paper and it was really meaty, and it's like you needed those extra 200 words, fine, I'm not going to penalize you. Or maybe just a little bit, not a big deal. But if you're someone that's like your paper's 2,200 words, but like I feel like I probably could have cut out 500 words and it would have been just as good. It could have been 1,700, but you were just lazy and you didn't do good editing. I'm going to be frustrated with that, and I'm going to mark you down significantly for that. And I think a lot of professors at a lot of schools kind of take a similar approach to that. So there are some professors that are just really, really, focused, like do not go over no matter what. So just make sure you talk to your professor. For my students, I will absolutely significantly mark off papers that don't meet the minimum requirement. In some classes, I actually tell some of my students, if you don't hit the minimum, you get a 0 because you didn't actually complete the assignment. In my mind, you did 0. In most classes, I don't do that, but just know that if you don't meet the word requirement and you're one of my students, the best you'll do is like 50 is a 50. Like if it's a perfect paper, you'll get a 50%, which is still an F. If it's not a perfect paper and you missed the word count, you're going to be lower than a 50. It's going to be very bad. So don't miss the word count. So again, whatever you are, just make sure you've talked to your professor and you do that. So, okay. So for my students, particularly students that are in my critical thinking class at BGU or in my contemporary issues class, we talk about various concepts within the genre of critical thinking and logic and rhetoric. And so it's important. I want my students to utilize concepts in their paper that they've learned in class. And I think most professors want this. So if you're writing a thesis paper, even if you're not one of my students, if there's concepts that you've learned in class from your professor, if there are easy ways for you to implement that, now don't force it, don't shoehorn it. If it's not there, then don't use it. But if there's natural, easy ways to utilize it, you should do that. So, so for my students, things like active listening, Adler's disagreement metrics, we've already talked about that in this video, some topical reading, logical fallacies, modes of persuasion, confirmation bias. These are all things. Let's say there's a piece of evidence that someone is bringing against. This is a counter argument, or this is an argument against your thesis. You could put forth that argument. You're going to interact with. You could say that the reason why this evidence is flawed is because it's illogical, and you could point out which logical fallacy that argument is committing. Or you could say, you could explain how this piece of evidence is rooted in groupthink or implicit bias. Or you can show how this particular evidence is seen to be faulty when you practice active listening. Right at face value, these arguments seem valuable. However, when the reader utilizes active listening, the reader quickly realizes that this argument actually is faulty or flawed, and then you show that, you demonstrate using what you learned in class in the paper. Right. That would be a big win. There are different types of research, qualitative versus quantitative. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but I just think it's important. If you're watching this video and you're one of my students, we've already covered this in class. If you're not one of my students, I just encourage you, just do some quick Google research on what is qualitative versus quantitative. Make sure you understand the difference. Make sure you understand the different types of sources that are out there, primary, secondary, or tertiary. Professors usually want in theological research as many primary and secondary sources as possible. I love primary sources. If you can get a lot of primary sources in your paper, that would be fantastic. So just right now, if you don't know what those things are, just pause this video, do a quick Google search on primary versus secondary versus tertiary sources, read about that, make sure you understand that, and then come back to this video. I think it's important. There's different quality of scholars out there. I think it's important to know the difference between the different types of scholars that exist, pro-doc versus research scholars. And I think it's important to know that if someone is a pro-doc, I mean, that they have a professional doctorate degree, you want to be utilizing them in the right way. So if your paper demands someone that has a research scholar background, you want to make sure you're not quoting someone that has an expertise in a different type of field. So I think it's just important to know the different types of scholarship that are out there. You want to make sure you also understand the difference between a peer-reviewed book and a trade book or a self-published book. I think that's important. There are organizations or experts out there that have significant clout that are not necessarily, they don't have a doctorate degree or they're not officially scholars. but they've got significant clout. So let's say the Gallup organization, it's an organization, and they have a lot of different people working for them that may or may not be official scholars. But the Gallup organization has proven to be a reputable organization in a lot of ways. I'll give you another example. Let's say I was writing a paper about about the atonement, and let's say I had a section about preaching the atonement. Well, let's say I quoted from Pastor Matt Chandler. Pastor Matt Chandler is a well-known pastor in the United States today. He does not have a doctorate degree. In fact, as of the recording this video, he doesn't even have a graduate degree. I think he only has a bachelor's degree. But if I'm talking about how to preach properly in the church, there's a section in my paper about preaching. Well, Matt Chandler knows a lot about preaching. He's a fantastic preacher. He's a well-known preacher. He's a well-respected preacher. He's got a lot of clout. So I could utilize him in my paper, even though he may not be a scholar. You just want to be careful that you don't do that a lot. You want to make sure you are quoting from scholarly sources, ideally from people that have legit, real doctorate degrees, PhDs. If you need a research scholar, and you want them to be in their field, right? You don't want to be quoting people outside of their field, which students do sometimes. And then you want to be drawing upon peer-reviewed material if you can, right? Peer-reviewed books, peer-reviewed papers, peer-reviewed journals, academic journals, things of that nature are really the best type of scholarship you want to be utilizing, if at all possible. Okay, there are different types of sources out there, books, journals, periodicals. I'm a big fan of journal articles because it's just easier to get through journals than it is books, to be honest. So I'm a big fan. I encourage you to check those out. Research sources, check your syllabus, right? Almost, pretty much every syllabus for every class out there is going to have a bibliography. That's the first place you should. I tell my students all the time. People are like, "Hey, where should I get resources?" I'm like, dude, I gave you 30 books or 60 books or whatever in the bibliography of the syllabus for the class. Like, I just handed you a bunch of great resources. Why are you not using them? I'm always surprised by that. There are a lot of online databases out there. JSTOR, Project Muse, Lexis Academic, EBSCO. There's all these ones. Also, if you have a library card, Overdrive and Hoopla are two fantastic apps. You can download books for free to your device. So your iPhone or your iPad or your Kindle, you can log in through Overdrive or Hoopla using your library card, and then just download those books, as many as you need, or a chunk of them, and then you can just digitally return them. It's fantastic. Also, if you have a library card, JSTOR is a great source. The JSTOR website, you can use your public library card. Most library systems in the United States are attached to the JSTOR database. If you your school may be attached also, so the school where I'm doing my PhD at current time, Midwestern Seminary in Kansas City, I can use my Midwestern student credentials to log into the JSTOR website and get a bunch of resources, either a bunch of them for free or very inexpensively. Or you can just sign up for a JSTOR account. I think at current time, as a recording of this video, I think it's like $20 a month or $30 a month to get a certain amount of resources. So if you're doing research, you can, sign up for a subscription for a month or two and then cancel it when you don't need it anymore. There may be a minimum subscription. I can't remember. It does vary. So just check that. But if you have a library card, a free library card from whatever the public library is in your town, your community, your county, most of the time you can utilize that to log into JSTOR free of charge, and you can download a certain number of resources either for free or relatively inexpensive. So just check that. JSTOR is a fantastic resource that you can check out. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so that was a power over something else. That's pretty much all the information that you need for this paper or for this. So this is pretty much how to write a thesis paper. I actually promised that I would give you some sample thesis statements, right? So let me pull that up. Let me do that very quickly. I should have had this prepared. I apologize that I did not, but I'm going to give you some quick examples of thesis statements that these are from students that I've utilized that could be helpful to you. Let me find that. Where is that? Give me a second. Here we go. All right. I'm going to share my screen now. Again, give me a second here. All right. Sharing that. And let me get into reader mode. All right. You should be able to see that there. Perfect. Okay. Sorry, I should have that ready. I apologize. Okay. So here are thesis statements that students of mine have used in assignments. So these are So these thesis statements are from a class I taught here at Bethany Global University called Gender and Sexuality. That was a class that we offer where we are tackling various contemporary issues related to gender and sexuality in our society from an Orthodox Christian, Orthodox little o, Orthodox Christian evangelical perspective. So here are the thesis papers. These are students of mine for papers that were written. So here's thesis number one. It says this paper will examine to history. It should have been the history. Sorry, I think the paper itself was probably accurate. It was just when I copied it into PowerPoint, I must have gotten it wrong. But the thesis statement for this paper was, this paper will examine the history of feminism in America and explain why it is bad for society. Now that probably sounds a little bit elementary, but still it's a clear thesis statement, right? They're studying the history of feminism and why it's bad for American society, right? And the paper did, I think this paper was like an A- paper, so it's pretty good. Here's another example. This paper will make the assertion that the primary way to strengthen male presence in the congregation, both in depth of relationship with God and in the amount of attendance, is to develop true and intimate fellowship between men. So this paper is basically arguing, right, that if you want men in our congregations, right, evangelicals struggle with getting men in the church. If we want male presence to be strengthened, both in their individual relationships with God and in how they engage in church, then you have to develop true and intimate fellowship between men. And this paper basically then defined what is true intimate fellowship. It defines that. It defines church, what is good church attendance, what is bad church attendance. And then this paper explained what would a strength in male depth of relationship look like. Like this paper then quickly defines each of these terms, and then this paper gave the evidences for, like why this is, why we would want male strength in our churches, and then it defines the evidences for how intimate fellowship fosters male strength. And he gave various pieces of information from the Bible and from the world of psychology and from church history. So this was a really good paper. I think this was also an A- paper. It was really good. Okay. Another thesis statement. The study that follows will show on what basis divorce and remarriage is biblically permissible by first examining what a biblical marriage is, then by establishing when it is biblical to get divorced, followed by when it is biblically correct to get remarried. Now, this thesis statement is probably a little bit wordy, but still clear to me what they are defending, right? The study that follows will show on what basis divorce and remarriage is biblically permissible. In fact, their thesis statement could have probably ended right there, and it would have been good. So a part of the class we talked about marriage and family, and divorce and remarriage, and this paper was all about divorce and remarriage, and it was really good. I think this was one of the few A+ papers that I gave in this class. It was really good paper. Another one. This paper will examine 1 Timothy 2 and will show why women should be allowed to be pastors. Very clear thesis statement, right? As a part of gender and sexuality class, we did cover gender roles in the family and in the local church and in society. We talked about traditional gender roles and whether or not we as contemporary evangelicals, whether or not we should embrace these things. So this student chose to defend why women should be allowed to be pastors. Of course, on the opposite, this is a different thesis paper from a different student. This paper will show that when we look at scripture as our authority, we clearly see that women are not allowed to hold the office of pastor in the church, right? So it's a different student defending a different thesis. Both of these were really good. I think these were A- papers in my class. Both were well done. Good. These are good thesis statements and good papers. Right. I'm not asking you to agree with me on the topic. That's not the point. The point is I want you to set forth a thesis statement, and I want you to defend it in your paper. And that's what a good thesis paper should do. Another one. In this essay, I will argue that people with homosexual orientation should not be married or ordained within a United Methodist Church, but can be a part of the congregation. Now, this one is a little unique because it's very specific. And the reason why this student chose this is because this student comes from a United Methodist background. And if you're not familiar right now, there's a major debate within the United Methodist denomination internationally about whether or not people who have a homosexual orientation should be allowed to be pastors or not. That's a major debate going on with within the denomination internationally. Well, this student comes from a United Methodist Church and really was wrestling with what she believed about this. And she came to the conclusion that that homosexuality is outside of God's design, and that we as evangelicals, we should embrace traditional biblical sexuality, right? Sexuality is within the bounds of marriage between one man and one woman. That was the traditional view that this person has chosen to embrace. That's what we at BGU embrace. We're evangelicals in that way. And so she was specifically crafting her paper around what was going on in the United Methodist Church because she was passionate about that, which, by the way, if you're struggling with how to figure out what thesis statement you want to cover, ask yourself, what am I passionate about? What's close to home? Or ask yourself, what topic is going on in my life that if I studied it, it would be beneficial for me. So she was saying it would be beneficial for me to study this topic so that when I go home to my church, I know how to engage in the conversation, right? So this is one of the ways in which you can help hone in on your topic. This is a brilliant thesis paper. It was a really good paper. There were a few flaws with it. I think this paper ended up being a B plus because there were a few things wrong with it that were significant, but still really good thesis paper with a really good sentiment behind it that I would really encourage you to think about. Another thesis statement: this paper will address how sexual education has in the past helped reduce unplanned pregnancies and sexual transmitted diseases due to the use of contraception. Currently, sexual education is less about educating kids about the dangers of sex resulting in STDs and unplanned pregnancies, but rather evolving in order to serve a progressive cultural agenda. This was also an excellent paper. I believe this was an A+ paper. And basically her thesis paper, her point in her paper was sexual education in America in the 1970s and 1980s and early 1990s was actually very helpful in a lot of ways to people. However, sexual education in America starting in the 90s begins to evolve. And by the time we get to the, to 2019, when this paper was written, when we get to 2019, basically sexual education is no longer helpful, but it's nothing more than just sexual propaganda being asserted. And it's kind of it's an indoctrination. It's a radical form of indoctrination that is actually the exact opposite. So she's arguing that sex education is necessary and helpful. However, it must be done properly, not the way it's being done. So she basically defends, there's multiple things she has to defend in this paper, and she does it really well in the paper. So good job, I thought, here. Another thesis statement: the purpose of this essay is to define and explain the position of complementarian opinion in marriage and to contend that it is the most logical application in light of the historical and linguistic backgrounds of the text and the conclusion and the worldview intended by the scripture itself. Basically, this person is saying when we value script, when we study scripture, complementarian opinion in marriage is the one that's the right one. That's the thesis of this paper. Again, you can disagree, that's fine, but I'm just highlighting that the thesis statements are good. Here's another one. This is an interesting one because we covered in the class in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about head covering. So this paper was the doctrine of head covering presented in 1 Corinthians by Paul is a biblical principle, not a cultural custom, and one that has very recently been lost by church history. And basically, this is a young woman who basically in the paper is making the case that women should still cover their heads. It was an interesting paper that I may not agree with, and I say that in class. But she made the case, and quite frankly, it was actually a good paper. She made the case well. I may disagree with it because I think she's uninformed in some things, but I think she did defend her thesis statement well in some ways. There was nothing glaring missing. So I appreciated this paper a lot. It was unique, and what I do for my students. If any of you watching this, you're my students. Just know this. That you can pick any topic that's covered in the entire course material. So for the class gender and sexuality, we covered 1 Corinthians 11, 12, and 14 because there are some things talking about gender roles and sexuality in those passages. So anything that's in those texts is fair game for a thesis paper. So if you're in my class, if you're one of my students, anything in any of the biblical texts that we cover in class, anything related to any of the topics we cover in class, and any subtopics, and you can contextualize it, for your context or for your background. All of those are totally fair game. So I just want you to know that. So you can write you could write a thesis paper about whatever you want, as long as it's related to the course material, right? Here's another one. This paper will highlight the ostracization inflicted upon neighboring gay, transgender, and queer Latinos and the barriers this ostracization creates in sharing the gospel with them. This was an excellent paper, probably the best paper of that class, in my opinion. It was fantastic. Basically, this young woman was passionate about this because she was a young Caucasian woman, but she was dating a Latino man, actually, and she later got engaged to him. And her boyfriend at the time had a cousin who was gay, who had really been ostracized by his family. And it really made it impossible for her and her boyfriend to reach out to that cousin and share the gospel, even though they wanted to. And she basically wrote a paper explaining how, when you ostracize people, this causes problems. And then she basically identified how this had the Latino American subculture ostracizes gay men and transgender men more than the other subcultures, more than white people and black people in America. The Hispanics and Latinos in America tend to be worse at this, was what her paper was about. And she really defends this really well in her paper. And then she basically explained how someone who feels ostracized will never receive the gospel, will never want to listen to the gospel. And she basically shows some statistics about how when people are ostracized, they reject messaging. And so again, it was excellent paper. It was related to the course material, because in the course we talked about homosexuality, we talked about sharing the gospel with people who identify as homosexual or transgender. And then she made it contextualized to her background and her experience. And she basically said to herself, what do I need to study to help me be efficient and equipped for the conversations that are ahead in my life? So it was a great paper. Here's another one, another thesis statement. It says, this persuasive paper will examine evangelism to the LGBT community and will argue that Christians should attend same-sex marriage ceremonies for evangelism purposes. Now, I will be honest, in the class, I made the case that I believe it is my conviction that I would never attend a same-sex marriage ceremony, and I explained why. But I challenged the students to do their own study, to prayerfully think about it on their own terms, and come to their own conclusions. And this student came to a conclusion different than my own. And she came to the conclusion, I think this was a young man, actually. This young man was making the argument, not because he was endorsing homosexuality. I think in the paper, he was making it clear, I believe, that homosexuality is outside of God's design, that evangelicals should embrace traditional view of sexuality. That evangelicals should reject the idea that homosexuality is not a sin, or that the practice of homosexuality is not a sin. But he was arguing that evangelicals still should attend same-sex marriage ceremonies for the purposes of evangelism, and he defends that in his paper. And I think he did it pretty good. I think this was like a B+ or A- paper. It's pretty good. Here's another thesis statement. This one is, this paper will demonstrate the Greek word authenteo, which is the Greek word that Paul uses in 1 Timothy chapter 2, refers to pastoral authority, therefore prohibiting women from holding the office of pastor within the local church, right? So Paul uses this Greek term authenteo. This paper was all about that particular Greek word, because this paper basically showed, if this Greek word means this, that means, it basically was like, if authenteo means X, women should not be allowed to be pastors. However, if authenteo means Z, women should be allowed to be pastors. And then he argues that that when Paul's using the Greek term authenteo, he is referring to X, this thing over here. He basically is juxtaposing. He's saying, like, there's two potential definitions for authenteo. If Paul means this definition over here, then women should not be allowed to be pastors. If Paul meant this definition over here, then women should be allowed to be pastors. And then he argues in the paper that Paul actually meant this over here, and that's the reason why we should prohibit women from being local church pastors in a local church context. So this paper was very specific. It wasn't just about whether or not women should be pastors. It wasn't all the reasons. It was specifically around the word authenteo. It was very, very granular, but thorough. It was an excellent paper. Okay, that's pretty much it. So that's all of the things I have for you. This video is now an hour long. I'm sure many of you are watching it on double speed, so you're only at 30 minutes probably, which is perfectly acceptable. So anyway, I hope this is helpful to you. Make sure you follow the instructions, follow the structure I've given here. Maybe get a hold of Kibi's book and learn from him. Write a thesis paper, pick a thesis, defend it thoroughly, give a conclusion. Make sure you write in third person, make it succinct, make it clear. Don't use a lot of fluff, and draw upon the wisdom you've gained from the conversation that you entered into. Be humble, try to be objective, and seek to be thorough in presenting your evidences as well as interacting with the counter evidences. Hope this video was helpful to you. If you have any questions and you're one of my students, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email or a text message, or whatever. Reach out to me. Let's talk. Please, if you're unclear about anything at all, do not hesitate to reach out to me directly. I'd love to have a conversation with you and help you whenever way I can. If you are not one of my students and you're just watching this because you found it on YouTube, glad to have you. Glad this was helpful to you. Hope this is helpful to you. And if you have any questions, feel free to just leave comment in the comment section below. And at my earliest convenience, I will try to respond to you whenever I get a chance to do that. Hope this is helpful again. Appreciate you guys. God bless you.